So this is some of the process of making a wool and fur bomber hat. I sewed together the two middle pieces and then they get pressed with the iron on both sides to make the seam lay nice and flat. And then I attach a side panel and that seam allowance gets trimmed and pressed upward, pressed on both sides again. And the little roundish thing that I'm using inside as a support while I'm pressing is called a pressing ham, which I always thought was kind of funny. It's like a rounded ironing board basically for ironing curved shapes. So I put on the other side panel, sewed it on, and then I'm pressing that also. And those I top stitch right after sewing them on. The center seam, I save that top stitching for the last thing I do before I sew on the fur, usually, although I forgot to do it this time. And now I'm adding the ear flaps. I had just sewn them, and now I'm putting them on and making sure they line up, and they didn't. So I re-sewed it with the seam allowance a little bit smaller to make that a little bit wider so it'll fit better and make my marks and my plaid pattern match up. So now I pin that and then I'll sew it. In order to have the plaid line up, the pattern pieces have to be cut out very precisely. Trim the seam allowance and that seam allowance gets pressed downward. And the center seam down the back is always a little bulky, so you can put that down and hammer it, which I just did there. And that just presses out some of the bulk. So now I'm punching holes so I can put the snaps into the forehead flap part. And setting those snaps. And then also putting in the pins so I can match up the pins with the marks on the fur to make sure everything's aligned. And I sew on the forehead flap and then place the snaps on the body of the hat. And then I have to rethread the machine because I had the wrong thread in there. And now I'm working on the lining, attaching the fur to the fabric lining. And then the lining and the shell of the hat go together right sides facing, and then I sew them together. I break a needle here. Oh, not yet. Break a needle here. So then I have to replace the needle. And then I get back to sewing. Now I turned the hat right side out. And now I'm going to attach the snap straps. They get a rivet to hold them in place. The rivet goes through both layers of the hat. And then lint roll to remove all the loose hair from the fabric. Then I realized right about now that I forgot to top stitch the center seam of the wool, which I usually do before sewing the shell and the lining together. And instead of taking apart the whole hat, I decide I can just seam rip a little bit of the lining and then top stitch through that hole basically. So then I go back and close that hole in the lining, which is normally the last step of finishing a hat, but I had just expanded the hole so that I could do that top stitching. One last lint roll, and then it's done and ready for pictures. If working with fur is something that you want to learn how to do, I do have patterns available for sale, classes coming up, and full tutorials available on my YouTube channel.